Hermeneutics is a word with a somewhat complex meaning. In a basic way, hermeneutics refers to a field of study that has to do with the nature of interpretation. Hermeneutics, in the first instance, was probably understood as being the art of interpretation. It has also been suggested that it may be more accurate to call hermeneutics a science. This idea of a science implies that there should be rigorous methodologies that govern hermeneutics, and there are many books available on this aspect of hermeneutics. Nevertheless, there has been something of a debate around the question of whether hermeneutics is an art or a science. This has led to the inevitable appeasing solution, suggesting that hermeneutics is both an art and a science. Now, if I'm really being pressed on this question, I tend to vary my answer depending on my mood. I may suggest that hermeneutics should be called either the science or the art of interpretation, or indeed both. But actually I'm uncomfortable with all of these options because, and this is kind of ironic, I find the language at the root of the debate somewhat improper. Hermeneutics is not a science in the same sense that the natural empirical sciences like biology or geology are sciences, nor is it an art in the same sense that disciplines such as music and writing, in their creative aspects, are considered arts. It is helpful to recall that hermeneutics is a meta-discipline when viewed in relation to interpretation. This means that hermeneutics is not interpretation itself, rather it interrogates interpretation. It asks questions like, what am I doing when I am interpreting? How exactly did I arrive at this interpretation? Or what principles am I using that guide my method of interpretation? In this sense, hermeneutics occupies the space that falls in between the work being interpreted and the interpretation itself. By way of illustration and explanation, I would like to quote the professional Logician's monologue on the Monty Python record released in 1975, entitled "The Album of the Soundtrack of the Trailer of the Film of Monty Python and the Holy Grail." The professional logician in the sketch makes the following statement with regard to his wife's ability to comprehend simple logic.
For example, given the premise all fish live underwater and all mackerel are fish, my wife will conclude not that all mackerel live underwater, but that if she buys kippers it will not rain, or that trout live in trees, or even that I do not love her any more. This she calls using her intuition. I call it crap, and it gets me very irritated because it is not logical.
The logician gives us two premises. These are, all fish live underwater and all mackerel are fish. Logic demands that there is only one conclusion, namely, all mackerel live underwater. On the other hand, the logician suggests that his wife may give three alternative conclusions based on her intuition. These are, 1. If she buys kippers it will not rain, or 2. That trout live in trees, or 3. That he does not love her anymore. In effect, the logician's wife strays from the formal answer that logic demands and deduces something else. But let us look at the third of her answers, purely because it is the most provocative as well as the funniest of her conclusions. Reminding ourselves of the premises, the information that the wife receives is 1. All fish live underwater, and 2. All mackerel are fish. Her conclusion on receiving this information is, you don't love me anymore. To the logician, the answer is incorrect. It is quite simply the wrong answer. In terms of pure logic, of course, the logician is correct. However, we are not in the realm of logic, but hermeneutics. This does not mean that hermeneutics is not logical, but rather that its interests are different. Hermeneutics is not so much interested in whether an interpretation is right or wrong, but rather how the particular interpretation was derived. So what can be said hermeneutically? 1. The premises in the sketch are the text that require interpretation. 2. The differing conclusions drawn by the logician and his wife are the interpretation. And 3, hermeneutics is located in the gap between these two. This gap is where hermeneutics happens, and it is this space that is frequently not even acknowledged. For the logician, the space is simply logic. For the wife, it is not that at all. She suggests that it is her intuition. This may in fact be very true, though what is not fully known to us is what is driving the intuition. Hermeneutically, her reasoning is certainly different to that of the logician, but it is not incorrect, even if she is wrong in her conclusion about her husband not loving her. Of course, all of this is fairly obvious, and we understand both the logician's logic and the wife's intuition. It is this that makes us able to comprehend the comedy and laugh. There is another way to look at this same idea. It is thought that the term hermeneutics may have its origin in the Greek messenger god Hermes. It was the task of Hermes to bring the word of the gods to the mortal folk on earth. Hermes would bring this word from the gods to the human prophet, like, for example, the Oracle of Delphi. This would enable the oracle to understand what the gods were up to. The oracle could then relay the message of Apollo to the people. This process presumes a certain line of communication. On the left, we have Apollo. Apollo summons Hermes and tells Hermes the message. What Apollo speaks is the unadulterated message. Hermes then puts his own spin on the message and delivers it to the oracle. The oracle judges this mediated message from Hermes as the truth, that is, straight from Apollo's mouth, but that is not quite right. It has been twisted by Hermes. So then, we now have the following allegory. Apollo speaks. This is the true message, the actual words. Hermes receives the message and puts his own spin on it. And then the oracle hears what Hermes says and assumes it is the actual word of Apollo. The allegory is relatively easy to then unpack. Apollo represents the text, whether it's a poem, a song, or whatever. This text is what we are trying to understand. Hermes represents the hermeneutical process. And finally, the oracle is the interpretation. Authorities in various disciplines, for example in religions, are not necessarily aware of the hermeneutical processes that inform their conclusions, even though their interpretations are frequently identified as the truth itself. This is why it is useful to consider that Hermes, who represents the particular hermeneutic in play, is actually a kind of invisible trickster who confounds the word of Apollo without us even being aware of his presence. The point is this: hermeneutics is always present and governing our interpretations, whether we know it or not. Wherever there is an interpretation, some or other hermeneutic is in play. The problem with the way we understand things is not that our interpretations are necessarily incorrect, but rather that the hermeneutic employed to arrive at the interpretation is not recognized or noticed. It is this that can dupe us over and over into believing we are right and every other interpretation is incorrect. We have forgotten that Hermes has stepped in between the text we are trying to interpret and shaped our interpretation of it. Once we understand the hermeneutic, we are able to understand why we have interpreted something in a particular way. In the professional logician's monologue, both the logician and his wife are correct. They are just using different hermeneutics. To experience the drama of another romantic relationship where the partners had a different hermeneutic, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Next week, we will be looking at the lyrical genius of Queen's Brian May and the remarkable opening track of the Sheer Heart Attack album, Brighton Rock.